everyone. We are going to be talking about 1 Samuel 16, when David gets anointed. Saul was the king at this time. And Samuel, the prophet, God talked to him and said, go anoint another king. Because Saul, he wasn't following God. He didn't believe in God. He pushed God away. So God had Samuel go to the house of Jesse in Bethlehem and anoint another king, one of his sons. So Samuel went to the house of Jesse, and he asked Jesse to bring his sons in front of him to anoint one. And so Jesse did. And the oldest son, he came in front of Samuel, and the Lord said no, because the Lord looks on the heart and the man looks on the outward appearance. And his heart wasn't in the right spot. And so all 7 of Jesse's sons passed before Samuel, and not one of them God took and anointed him. They weren't the right ones. So Samuel asked Jesse if this was all his sons, and he said, all but the youngest one. So Samuel said to Jesse, send for him. We will wait for him. So they sent for David. He was a shepherd out in the fields, watching over the sheep. And so they called him up, and when he came in front of Samuel, the Lord said, this is the one. So Samuel anointed him. I'm going to read 1 Samuel 16 verse 13. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day on the Spirit of the Lord came powerful upon David. Samuel returned to Ramah. And so when God calls us to do something, he called David to be king. So he anointed David. And then he didn't go into being a king for quite a while after this. He didn't even go into the kingdom until a couple years go by, when he goes in and plays the harp for the king, which the Lord had to train him to be a king, because he was this little shepherd boy, didn't know nothing about being a king. So when God called him, he wasn't ready to do the mission God called him to do. And so when God calls us to do his mission, I believe that God calls everyone to do his mission. Every one of us. And so if we want to accept his mission for our lives, we have to let God be in control and let it be in God's timing. If it's in our timing, it doesn't work for God. It has to be in God's time. And so I think God is calling me to be a missionary. I mean, we do these VBSs and you see the joy you bring on the kids' faces. that brings me joy, that I'm doing God's work.
Everyone, so we just finished chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, where David was anointed king. And now we're moving on to 1 Samuel 17, where David faces his giant. It all starts with the Philistine army staying on one side and the army of Israel on the other. And there was a valley between them. The armies of the Philistines had a champion whose name was Goliath. Goliath was nearly 7 feet tall. That's bigger than most doorways. He was so big, the armor that he wore was nearly 157 pounds. That's nearly the weight of 3 kids that are about 50 pounds each. And he went to the armies of Israel for 40 days, both morning and evening, and he said, "Why have you come to battle? Am I not a Philistine, one of the greatest of all warriors? Bring to me a man so that we may fight. If he is able to defeat me, then we'll be your servants. But if I win against him, then you will be our servants. I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul heard these words, he was really sad. How could they fight such a great foe? One day, back in Bethlehem, Jesse told his son David to take some dried grain, 10 loaves of bread, and bring it to the camp, and carry 10 cheese to the captain of their army, and to bring back word of how his brothers were doing. And which is, his father was concerned about his brothers. So David rose early in the morning and went as Jesse, his father, had commanded him. And now when he got there, Goliath was doing his daily rant, if you will. "Fee-fi-fo fum, I am the greatest. Give me your warrior." And this time David heard it. And instead of being afraid like the rest of the army, he went to Saul and said, "Let me fight this great foe." And Saul said, "No way, you're just a kid. You can't do it." And David went on to say that he used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear took his father's sheep, he would go and defeat that animal and bring back his father's sheep. And he had never had any problem because he had defeated a number of animals ever since he was little. And he said, "As the Lord delivered me from the animal's hand, so shall he deliver me from Goliath's hand." And Saul said, "Okay, go ahead, may the Lord be with you." And then Saul went and gave David his own armor. He put a bronze helmet on David's head, and he clothed him in a coat of mail. Now when David got all the armor on, and he was kind of ready to go, and he tried to take a step, he went, it's not gonna work. He turned to Saul and said that he cannot use them because he was not used to them. So David took them off. David then took 5 smooth stones from a brook, and he took his slingshot, and he went down to meet Goliath in battle. At the sight of David, Goliath was like, "Ha! I'm gonna squeeze you like a bug." But David wasn't afraid. He ran to meet Goliath, and he said, I'm gonna beat you. He ran to Goliath, he swung his stone, let it fly, and it hit Goliath right in the forehead. When Goliath had fallen, he was not yet dead. And remember, David had said he would take Goliath's head. So And David also didn't have a sword. So David took Goliath's own sword and used it to cut off his head. And the Philistines then ran when they saw that their champion was defeated. David took the head of Goliath and returned to Jerusalem. Now, just think for a minute. David was this child against this giant man. And he had nothing but a slingshot and 5 stones. And he only needed one of them to take down Goliath. When you think about when he was going to fight Goliath, do you think he was scared? No. He knew that the Lord would take care of him and deliver him from the hands of Goliath. And recently in my own life, I've had to face my own giants. I am afraid of doctors. We all are. But recently I had to go to a bunch of doctors to try and figure out a number of my problems. And I trusted in the Lord, and I said, okay, Lord, it's in your hands. I need your help. And now I know a lot more about my health. I know more about what's going on and how to take care of it. And it's just really important to always depend on the Lord and know that He is going to carry you through. And you also need to do your part and remember to invite Him in and ask for His help.
Hey everybody. So we're continuing on in the story of David, and we just saw in chapter 17, 1 Samuel, David and Goliath, where David has this huge mountain peak experience, and as tends to happen with many of us, most of us, we often have these huge mountain peak experiences, and what happens right after that? We have these valley experiences, or what Elizabeth Talbot calls, who I was watching recently, the in-between times, these times of just not knowing what's going to happen next. And this is where we see David headed. We see David coming off of this victorious moment. God is with him. God is making it very clear he's this victor. And then right behind this, Saul, who's king, is so jealous of David that he wants to kill him. Chapter 18, Saul is making it miserable for David. And David is fearing for his life, rightly so. Saul's after him. We see in chapter 20 of 1 Samuel as well, where David and Jonathan make this plan, and David finally just has to flee. He leaves, and he ends up in this cave in chapter 22. And he's in this cave, and you have to wonder what's going through David's head. You know, he was anointed. God has told him he's going to be the next king. He's promised him this. And here he is sitting in this cave, being treated like an outlaw. He's being hunted down. He's a marked man. You have to wonder, did I miss the mark somewhere? God, what is it that you're trying to tell me here? What am I missing? And we see in one of the Psalms that David wrote, this is Psalms 57. This is about when he fled to the cave from Saul. Chapter 57, verse 1 says, "Have mercy on me, my God. Have mercy on me, for in you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed." I mean, this is David saying, I'm fleeing for my life, but I take refuge in you. Please help me during this time. How many of us have been in that very confusing time? You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know when you step out in the middle of it where you're going to next. Elizabeth Talbot added a quote that she had found that said, faith really isn't going from point A to point B. Faith is really about leaving point A. In other words, having no idea where point B may fall. And I can relate to this. I've been in what she calls these in-between times where you don't know where God is leading you. Most recently, this has happened with my job. And I'll admit, I have not handled it as well as I should have. I've been angry, I've been sour, I've been bitter about things. But one of the things that I am learning as God is using this time in me to kind of, okay, calm down, think these things through. I'm learning so much more about patience. I'm learning so much more about kindness. I'm learning about what God really wants me. I'm learning what's really important. And truthfully, you know, if my job is the most important thing to me, then I have totally missed the mark. That is not all that God has for my life. And David comes to this realization as well that God has so much more for his life than just anointing him and then suddenly becoming king. There's so many lessons that he's teaching David during this time. And some of them are the same lessons that I just told you that I'm learning about patience, about how to treat others. We see this with David. This is chapter 24 of 1 Samuel. When David has opportunities to take Saul's lives, he could have remained bitter. He could have been angry and said, you know what, I'm just going to get rid of you. You're hunting me down. I'm going to do the same to you. And he doesn't. In chapter 24, he actually has cut a piece of Saul's robe, and he feels so guilty that he has done this, that he actually says, in verse 11, "See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me." He says, Saul, I'm not going to lay a hand on you. God has anointed you just as well. But it is not my job to take vengeance on you. God is going to figure that out, and God has a better plan for my life. Back over to Psalms 57 at the end of it. Remember, I just read a few moments ago, "Have mercy on me, my God." David ends this, starting in verse 9. "I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among peoples. For great is your love, reaching to the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the sky. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth." This is what I want for my life. I want God to be able to use the in-between times for me to be able to say, I'm going to praise you. I'm going to trust you in the hard times. No matter what happens, God, I know that you have a better plan and that you can guide my life onto your purposes.
Hey everybody. So we have been following David's life, and he has finally become king. So I'm going to read here in 2 Samuel 5, 1 through 5. "Then all the tribes of Israel went to David at Hebron and told him, 'We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, when Saul was our king, you were the one who really led the forces of Israel. And the Lord told you, you will be the shepherd of my people. You will be Israel's leader.' So there at Hebron, King David made a covenant before the Lord with all of the elders of Israel, and they anointed him king of Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years in all. He had reigned over Judah from Hebron for 7 years and 6 months, and from Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah for 33 years. So David is finally king after all these years. I mean, he was 30 when he became king. So that's a long time, and he went through a lot in those years. He went from being a shepherd to defeating Goliath, to being the captain of Saul's army, to running from Saul because he was trying to kill him. And so after all this time, he's finally become king. But that was God's mission for him all along, even though it didn't happen right away, because God was preparing him. I mean, all these experiences along the way made David a better king. It gave him the knowledge for all the wars that David was in. It gave him all those experiences, made him a better king for it. And God wasn't, even though God, when David was younger and he was anointed, God didn't just hand him over the kingdom there, because it probably wouldn't have ended so well. But no, he took the time and he prepared him and used those years to make him a better king in the end. So I think the point that I really like about this is that when God calls you, he's going to prepare you. He's not going to just, leave you hanging there and let you figure it out on your own. I think also, even though David, his mission was to become a king, it's not, our mission isn't going to be something like that always. It's not going to be so big and glamorous. It could be something small. It could be, your mission could be how you participate in the church. It could be VBS. It could be even how you treat people, I think sometimes. Like in your work environment or your friends or your family. It can be anything that God calls you to. And He's going to be there with you, and He's going to prepare you for that. So I think that's the biggest thing I got out of this part of David's story, was even though God had a mission for David, and he, his mission was fulfilled, He was also there with him along the whole way, and He prepared him so that he'd be ready for it.
Hello, we just finished with 2 Samuel 5, where David was just crowned king. Now we are moving on to 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, where we will be talking about forgiveness and where David encounters his first downfall. In chapter 11, verse 2, David sees a beautiful woman taking a shower and knows that he simply must have her. In verse 3, he learns that the woman's name is Bathsheba and that she is married to another man. In this moment, he should have stopped. She would never be his. She was married to another man, but lust and jealousy had taken over his heart. In verse 14, David then gives into temptation and has her husband sent to the front lines of the war, where he dies. It was through David's command that her husband met his demise. In God's eyes, it was no different than from murder. David did a very selfish thing, having the woman's husband killed so that he could have her. In verse 27, David takes Bathsheba as his wife and has a son with her. It then goes on to chapter 12, verse 7, where the Bible continues on to say how a prophet named Nathan was sent from the Lord to rebuke David for his actions. Verse 13 shows that David was remorseful for his sin. Nathan said that David himself would not die for his sins, but his son, born to Bathsheba, would. In verse 16, David begs the Lord to spare his son, but to no avail. David had committed a horrible thing. In verse 19, the child had died. David then went on to comfort his wife Bathsheba, and they went on to have another son. This one, named Solomon, the Lord loved. All was well again. God had forgiven him and again had his blessing. One time, my friend and I were playing a game on my bed. She playfully pushed me, but I fell off the bed and I hurt my ankle. Instead of being mad at her, instead of saying hateful, hurtful things and ending our friendship, I realized that it was an accident. I accepted her apologies and forgave her for hurting me, because that is what God would have wanted. It would have been selfish to hate her for such a simple thing. When someone does something to hurt you, it is best to forgive them, as God has forgiven us and all of our sins and imperfections, so we should forgive each other for wrongdoings. Imagine where we would be if God had never forgiven us. we would be forever lost. Instead, Jesus died so all of our sins could be forgiven. And now we can always call upon the Lord for strength and forgiveness. Even if someone does something so horrible you don't think that you could ever forgive them, you can always pray and ask for strength to forgive that person so that you can continue with your life.